The Secret Teachings of All Ages, by Manly Palmer Hall. Introduction. The definition of philosophy and a survey of its ancient schools. Philosophy is the discipline concerned with evaluating values. The determination of the superiority of any state or substance over another rests within its scope. By assigning primary importance to what remains after all secondary considerations are removed, philosophy becomes the true measure of priority and emphasis in the domain of speculative thought. The purpose of philosophy beforehand is to establish the connection between manifested phenomena and their invisible ultimate cause or nature. Philosophy has been described by Sir William Hamilton as the study of divine and human matters and the causes that contain them, the investigation of effects through their causes, the examination of sufficient reasons, the inquiry into possible entities insofar as they can exist, the deduction of evident truths from first principles, the study of sensible and abstract truths, the application of reason to its proper objects, the exploration of the relationships of all knowledge to the necessary ends of human reason, the study of the original form of the self or ego, the investigation of sciences in general, the analysis of the absolute, and the understanding of the identity and non-identity of ideals and reality. Philosophy is commonly organized under 6 principal branches. Metaphysics addresses abstract matters such as cosmology, theology, and the nature of existence. Logic examines the principles governing rational thought and the identification of fallacies. Ethics studies morality, individual responsibility, and character, with particular attention to defining the nature of good. Psychology focuses on phenomena with mental origins, investigating and classifying them. Epistemology considers the nature and possibility of knowledge itself, questioning whether absolute knowledge is attainable. Aesthetics explores the nature of beauty, harmony, elegance, and nobility, and the responses they evoke. Plato regarded philosophy as the supreme gift of divinity to humanity. In the 20th century, it has evolved into a complex structure of often contradictory concepts, each supported by compelling logic. The elevated doctrines of the Old Academy, once compared by Iamblichus to the nectar and ambrosia of the gods, have been so altered by opinion, which Heraclitus deemed a mental malady, that their original splendor is nearly unrecognizable. The increasing materialism of modern scientific and philosophical thought illustrates its superficial tendencies. When asked by Napoleon why God was omitted in his treatise on celestial mechanics, Laplace responded that there was no need for such a hypothesis. Sir Francis Bacon summarized the influence of philosophy in relation to belief, asserting that a slight engagement with philosophy may incline the mind toward atheism, yet profound philosophical understanding ultimately directs the mind toward religion. Aristotle opened his metaphysics by asserting that all humans possess a natural desire for knowledge. To fulfill this desire, the human intellect has explored the vast reaches of external and internal reality, seeking to understand the relationships between effect and cause, nature and its foundations, mind and source, spirit and substance, and illusion and reality. An ancient philosopher declared that one ignorant of common matters is a brute among men, one acquainted only with human concerns is a man among brutes, and one who knows all that can be known through intellectual effort attains the status of a god among men. Human status in the natural world is thus determined by the quality of thought. Those enslaved to base instincts are philosophically inferior to animals. Those who reason about human affairs are men, and those who elevate their intellect to divine realities approach demigodhood, partaking in the luminosity of their reason. Cicero celebrated philosophy as the guiding force of life, the promoter of virtue and the deterrent of vice, whose presence enables society and social cohesion. In contemporary times, philosophy is often fragmented into conflicting isms preoccupied with disproving one another, neglecting broader concerns of divine order and human destiny. Ideally, philosophy stabilizes human thought and prevents the establishment of irrational codes of conduct. Yet philosophers have often hindered this purpose by overcomplicating discourse for those they are meant to guide. Comprehensive classification of all philosophical schools exceeds the scope of this discussion, but the most influential systems over the last 26 centuries reveal the breadth of philosophical speculation. Greek philosophy began with the 7 thinkers honored with the title of the wise, including Thales, Solon, Chelon, Pittacus, Bias, Cleobulus, and Periander. Thales proposed water as the primary element, with the earth floating upon it and earthquakes resulting from its disturbances. His Ionian school continued through Anaximander, Anaximenes, Anaxagoras, and Archelaus. Anaximander posited limitless, indefinable infinity as the principle generating all things. Anaximenes identified air as the first element, constituting souls and even the divine. Anaxagoras described God as an infinite self-moving mind, organizing the initially chaotic matter according to divine order. Archelaus maintained that mind and air constitute all things, with rarefied air producing fire and condensed air producing water, conceiving the stars as burning iron masses. Heraclitus asserted fire as the first element and the ultimate state of the world, attributing the soul of the world to exhalations and the tides to the sun. The Pythagorean school, originating with Pythagoras of Samos, included Empedocles, Epicharmus, Archytas, Alcmaeon, Hippasus, Philolaus, and Eudoxus. Pythagoras emphasized mathematics as the most sacred and precise science and required his students to study arithmetic, music, astronomy, and geometry, highlighting the necessity of a philosophical life for the attainment of wisdom. Pythagoras was one of the first teachers to establish a community wherein all the members were of mutual assistance to one another in the common attainment of the higher sciences. He also introduced the discipline of retrospection as essential to the development of the spiritual mind. Pythagoreanism may be summarized as a system of metaphysical speculation concerning the relationships between numbers and the causal agencies of existence. This school also first expounded the theory of celestial harmonics or the music of the spheres. John Reuchlin said of Pythagoras that he taught nothing to his disciples before the discipline of silence, silence being the first rudiment of contemplation. In his Sophist, Aristotle credits Empedocles with the discovery of rhetoric. Both Pythagoras and Empedocles accepted the theory of transmigration, the latter saying, "A boy I was, then did a maid become, a plant, bird, fish, and in the vast sea swum." Archytas is credited with invention of the screw and the crane. Pleasure he declared to be a pestilence because it was opposed to the temperance of the mind. He considered a man without deceit to be as rare as a fish without bones. The Eleatic sect was founded by Xenophanes, who was conspicuous for his attacks upon the cosmologic and theogonic fables of Homer and Hesiod. Xenophanes declared that God was one and incorporeal, in substance and figure round, in no way resembling man, that he is all sight and all hearing, but breathes not, that he is all things, the mind and wisdom, not generate but eternal, impassible, immutable, and rational. Xenophanes believed that all existing things were eternal, that the world was without beginning or end, and that everything which was generated was subject to corruption. He lived to great age and is said to have buried his sons with his own hands. Parmenides studied under Xenophanes, but never entirely subscribed to his doctrines. Parmenides declared the senses to be uncertain and reason the only criterion of truth. He first asserted the earth to be round and also divided its surface into zones of here and cold. Melissus, who is included in the Eleatic school, held many opinions in common with Parmenides. He declared the universe to be immovable because, occupying all space, there was no place to which it could be moved. He further rejected the theory of a vacuum in space. Zeno of Elea also maintained that a vacuum could not exist. Rejecting the theory of motion, he asserted that there was but one God, who was an eternal, ungenerated being. Like Xenophanes, he conceived deity to be spherical in shape. Leucippus held the universe to consist of two parts, one full and the other a vacuum. From the infinite a host of minute fragmentary bodies descended into the vacuum, where, through continual agitation, they organized themselves into spheres of substance. The great Democritus to a certain degree enlarged upon the atomic theory of Leucippus. Democritus declared the principles of all things to be twofold, atoms and vacuum. Both, he asserted, are infinite atoms in number, vacuum in magnitude. Thus all bodies must be composed of atoms or vacuum. Atoms possess two properties, form and size, both characterized by infinite variety. The soul Democritus also conceived to be atomic in structure and subject to dissolution with the body. The mind he believed to be composed of spiritual atoms. Aristotle intimates that Democritus obtained his atomic theory from the Pythagorean doctrine of the monad. Among the Eleatics are also included Protagoras and Anaxarchus. Socrates, the founder of the Socratic sect, being fundamentally a skeptic, did not force his opinions upon others, but through the medium of questionings caused each man to give expression to his own philosophy. According to Plutarch, Socrates conceived every place as appropriate for reaching in that the whole world was a school of virtue. He held that the soul existed before the body and, prior to immersion therein, was endowed with all knowledge, that when the soul entered into the material form it became stupefied, but that by discourses upon sensible objects it was caused to reawaken and to recover its original knowledge. On these premises was based his attempt to stimulate the soul power through irony and inductive reasoning. It has been said of Socrates that the sole subject of his philosophy was man. He himself declared philosophy to be the way of true happiness and its purpose twofold: to contemplate God and to abstract the soul from corporeal sense. The principles of all things he conceived to be three in number: God, matter, and ideas. Of God he said, "What he is I know not, what he is not I know." Matter he defined as the subject of generation and corruption, idea as an incorruptible substance, the intellect of God. Wisdom he considered the sum of the virtues. Among the prominent members of the Socratic sect were Xenophon, Aeschines, Crito, Simon, Glauco, Simmias, and Cebes. Professor Zeller, the great authority on ancient philosophies, has recently declared the writings of Xenophon relating to Socrates to be forgeries. When The Clouds of Aristophanes, a comedy written to ridicule the theories of Socrates, was first presented, the great skeptic himself attended the play. During the performance, which caricatured him seated in a basket high in the air studying the sun, Socrates rose calmly in his seat, the better to enable the Athenian spectators to compare his own unprepossessing features with the grotesque mask worn by the actor impersonating him. The Elean sect was founded by Phaedo of Elis, a youth of noble family, who was bought from slavery at the instigation of Socrates and who became his devoted disciple. Plato so highly admired Phaedo's mentality that he named one of the most famous of his discourses the Phaedo. Phaedo was succeeded in his school by Plisthenes, who in turn was followed by Menedemus. Of the doctrines of the Elean sect little is known. Menedemus is presumed to have been inclined toward the teachings of Stilpo and the Megarian sect. When Menedemus' opinions were demanded, he answered that he was free, thus intimating that most men were enslaved to their opinions. Menedemus was apparently of a somewhat belligerent temperament and often returned from his lectures in a badly bruised condition. The most famous of his propositions is stated thus: "That which is not the same is different from that with which it is not the same." This point being admitted, Menedemus continued, "To benefit is not the same as good, therefore good does not benefit." After the time of Menedemus, the Elean sect became known as the Eretrian. Its exponents denounced all negative propositions and all complex and abstruse theories, declaring that only affirmative and simple doctrines could be true. The Megarian sect was founded by Euclid of Megara, a great admirer of Socrates. The Athenians passed a law decreeing death to any citizen of Megara found in the city of Athens. Nothing daunted, Euclid donned woman's clothing and went at night to study with Socrates. After the cruel death of their teacher, the disciples of Socrates, fearing a similar fate, fled to Megara, where they were entertained with great honor by Euclid. The Megarian school accepted the Socratic doctrine that virtue is wisdom, adding to it the Eleatic concept that goodness is absolute unity and all change an illusion of the senses. Euclid maintained that good has no opposite and therefore evil does not exist. Being asked about the nature of the gods, he declared himself ignorant of their disposition save that they hated curious persons. The Megarians are occasionally included among the dialectic philosophers. Euclid was succeeded in his school by Eubulides, among whose disciples were Alexinus and Apollonius Cronus. Euphantus, who lived to great age and wrote many tragedies, was among the foremost followers of Eubulides. Diodorus is usually included in the Megarian school, having heard Eubulides lecture. According to legend, Diodorus died of grief because he could not answer instantly certain questions asked him by Stilpo, at one time master of the Megarian school. Diodorus held that nothing can be moved, since to be moved it must be taken out of the place in which it is and put into the place where it is not, which is impossible because all things must always be in the places where they are. The Cynics were a sect founded by Antisthenes of Athens, a disciple of Socrates. Their doctrine may be described as an extreme individualism which considers man as existing for himself alone and advocates surrounding him by inharmony, suffering, and direst need that he may thereby be driven to retire more completely into his own nature. The Cynics renounced all worldly possessions, living in the rudest shelters and subsisting upon the coarsest and simplest food. On the assumption that the gods wanted nothing, the Cynics affirmed that those whose needs were fewest consequently approached closest to the divinities. Being asked what he gained by a life of philosophy, Antisthenes replied that he had learned how to converse with himself. Diogenes of Sinopes is remembered chiefly for the tub in the Metrum, which for many years served him as a home. The people of Athens loved the beggar philosopher, and when a youth in jest bored holes in the tub, The city presented Diogenes with a new one and punished the youth. Diogenes believed that nothing in life can be rightly accomplished without exercitation. He maintained that everything in the world belongs to the wise, a declaration which he proved by the following logic. All things belong to the gods are friends to wise persons, all things are common amongst friends, therefore all things belong to the wise. Among the cynics are Monimus, Onesicritus, Crates, Metricles, Hipparchia, Menippus, and Menedemus. The Cyrenaic sect, founded by Aristippus of Cyrene, promulgated the doctrine of hedonism. Learning of the fame of Socrates, Aristippus journeyed to Athens and applied himself to the teachings of the great skeptic. Socrates, pained by the voluptuous and mercenary tendencies of Aristippus, vainly labored to reform the young man. Aristippus has the distinction of being consistent in principle and practice, for he lived in perfect harmony with his philosophy that the quest of pleasure was the chief purpose of life. The doctrines of the Cyrenaics may be summarized thus. All that is actually known concerning any object or condition is the feeling which it awakens in man's own nature. In the sphere of ethics, that which awakens the most pleasant feeling is consequently to be esteemed as the greatest good. Emotional reactions are classified as pleasant or gentle, harsh and mean. The end of pleasant emotion is pleasure, the end of harsh emotion, grief, the end of mean emotion, nothing. Through mental perversity some men do not desire pleasure. In reality, however, pleasure is the true end of existence and exceeds in every way mental and spiritual enjoyments. Pleasure, furthermore, is limited wholly to the moment. Now is the only time. The past cannot be regarded without regret, and the future cannot be faced without misgiving. Therefore, neither is conducive to pleasure. No man should grieve, for grief is the most serious of all diseases. Nature permits man to do anything he desires. He is limited only by his own laws and customs. A philosopher is one free from envy, love, and superstition, and whose days are one long round of pleasure. Indulgence was thus elevated by Aristippus to the chief position among the virtues. He further declared philosophers to differ markedly from other men in that they alone would not change the order of their lives if all the laws of men were abolished. Among prominent philosophers influenced by the Cyrenaic doctrines were Hegesias, Anaxagoras, Theodorus, and Bion. The sect of the academic philosophers instituted by Plato was divided into three major parts: the Old, the Middle, and the New Academy. Among the old academics were Speusippus, Xenocrates, Polemon, Crates, and Crantor. Arcesilaus instituted the Middle Academy, and Carneades founded the New. Chief among the masters of Plato was Socrates. Plato traveled widely and was initiated by the Egyptians into the profundities of Hermetic philosophy. He also derived much from the doctrines of the Pythagoreans. Cicero describes the threefold constitution of Platonic philosophy as comprising ethics, physics, and dialectics. Plato defined good as threefold in character: good in the soul, expressed through the virtues; good in the body, expressed through the symmetry and endurance of the parts; and good in the external world, expressed through social position and companionship. In the book of Speusippus on Platonic definitions, that great Platonist thus defines God: a being that lives immortally by means of himself alone, sufficing for his own blessedness, the eternal essence, cause of his own goodness. According to Plato, the one is the term most suitable for defining the absolute, since the whole precedes the parts and diversity is dependent on unity. but unity not on diversity. The One, moreover, is before being, for to be is an attribute or condition of the One. Platonic philosophy is based upon the postulation of three orders of being: that which moves unmoved, that which is self-moved, and that which is moved. That which is immovable but moves is anterior to that which is self-moved, which likewise is anterior to that which it moves. That in which motion is inherent cannot be separated from its motive power. It is therefore incapable of dissolution. Of such nature are the immortals. That which has motion imparted to it from another can be separated from the source of its animating principle. It is therefore subject to dissolution. Of such nature are mortal beings. Superior to both the mortals and the immortals is that condition which continually moves yet itself is unmoved. To this constitution the power of abidance is inherent. It is therefore the divine permanence upon which all things are established. Being nobler even than self-motion, the unmoved mover is the first of all dignities. The Platonic discipline was founded upon the theory that learning is really reminiscence, or the bringing into objectivity of knowledge formerly acquired by the soul in a previous state of existence. At the entrance of the Platonic school in the academy were written the words, "Let none ignorant of geometry enter here." After the death of Plato, his disciples separated into two groups. One, the academics, continued to meet in the academy where once he had presided. The other, the peripatetics, removed to the Lyceum under the leadership of Aristotle. Plato recognized Aristotle as his greatest disciple and, according to Philoponus, referred to him as the mind of the school. If Aristotle were absent from the lectures, Plato would say, "The intellect is not here." Of the prodigious genius of Aristotle, Thomas Taylor writes in his introduction to the Metaphysics, "When we consider that he was not only well acquainted with every science, as his works abundantly evince, but that he wrote on almost every subject which is comprehended in the circle of human knowledge, and this with matchless accuracy and skill, we know not which to admire most, the penetration or extent of his mind." Of the philosophy of Aristotle, the same author says, "The end of Aristotle's moral philosophy is perfection through the virtues, and the end of his contemplative philosophy and union with the one principle of all things." Aristotle conceived philosophy to be twofold, practical and theoretical. Practical philosophy embraced ethics and politics, theoretical philosophy, physics and logic. Metaphysics he considered to be the science concerning that substance which has the principle of motion and rest inherent to itself. To Aristotle the soul is that by which man first lives, feels, and understands. Hence to the soul he assigned three faculties: nutritive, sensitive, and intellective. He further considered the soul to be twofold, rational and irrational, and in some particulars elevated the sense perceptions above the mind. Aristotle defined wisdom as the science of first causes. The four major divisions of his philosophy are dialectics, physics, ethics, and metaphysics. God is defined as the first mover, the best of beings, an immovable substance, separate from sensible things, void of corporeal quantity, without parts and indivisible. Platonism is based upon a priori reasoning, Aristotelianism upon a posteriori reasoning. Aristotle taught his pupil, Alexander the Great, to feel that if he had not done a good deed he had not reigned that day. Among his followers were Theophrastus, Strato, Lyco, Aristo, Critolaus, and Diodorus. Of skepticism as propounded by Pyrrho of Elis and by Timon, Sextus Empiricus said that those who seek must find or deny they have found or can find, or persevere in the inquiry. Those who suppose they have found truth are called dogmatists. Those who think it incomprehensible are the academics. Those who still seek are the skeptics. The attitude of skepticism towards the knowable is summed up by Sextus Empiricus in the following words. But the chief ground of skepticism is that to every reason there is an opposite reason equivalent, which makes us forbear to dogmatize. The skeptics were strongly opposed to the dogmatists and were agnostic in that they held the accepted theories regarding deity to be self-contradictory and undemonstrable. How, asked the skeptic, can we have indubitate knowledge of God, knowing not his substance, form, or place? For, while philosophers disagree irreconcilably on these points, their conclusions cannot be considered as undoubtedly true. Since absolute knowledge was considered unattainable, the skeptics declared the end of their discipline to be, in opinionatives, in disturbance, in impulsives, moderation, and in disquietives, suspension. The sect of the Stoics was founded by Zeno, the Cydian, who studied under Crates the Cynic, from which sect the Stoics had their origin. Zeno was succeeded by Cleanthes, Chrysippus, Zeno of Tarsus, Diogenes, Antipater, Panetius, and Posidonius. Most famous of the Roman Stoics are Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius. The Stoics were essentially pantheists, since they maintained that as there is nothing better than the world is God. Zeno declared that the reason of the world is diffused throughout it as seed. Stoicism is a materialistic philosophy, enjoining voluntary resignation to natural law. Chrysippus maintained that good and evil being contrary, both are necessary since each sustains the other. The soul was regarded as a body distributed throughout the physical form and subject to dissolution with it. Though some of the Stoics held that wisdom prolonged the existence of the soul, actual immortality is not included in their tenets. The soul was said to be composed of 8 parts: the 5 senses, the generative power, the vocal power, and an 8th or hegemonic part. Nature was defined as God mixed throughout the substance of the world. All things were looked upon as bodies either corporeal or incorporeal. Meekness marked the attitude of the Stoic philosopher. While Diogenes was delivering a discourse against anger, one of his listeners spat contemptuously in his face. Receiving the insult with humility, the great Stoic was moved to retort, "I am not angry, but am in doubt whether I ought to be so or not." Epicurus of Samos was the founder of the Epicurean sect, which in many respects resembles the Cyrenaic but is higher in its ethical standards. The Epicureans also posited pleasure as the most desirable state, but conceived it to be a grave and dignified state achieved through renunciation of those mental and emotional inconstancies which are productive of pain and sorrow. Epicurus held that as the pains of the mind and soul are more grievous than those of the body, so the joys of the mind and soul exceed those of the body. The Cyrenaics asserted pleasure to be dependent upon action or motion. The Epicureans claimed rest or lack of action to be equally productive of pleasure. Epicurus accepted the philosophy of Democritus concerning the nature of atoms and based his physics upon this theory. The Epicurean philosophy may be summed up in 4 canons. Sense is never deceived, and therefore every sensation and every perception of an appearance is true. Opinion follows upon sense and is superadded to sensation, and capable of truth or falsehood, all opinion attested, or not contradicted by the evidence of sense, is true. An opinion contradicted, or not attested by the evidence of sense, is false. Among the Epicureans of note were Metrodorus of Lampsacus, Zeno of Sidon, and Phaedrus. Eclecticism may be defined as the practice of choosing apparently irreconcilable doctrines from antagonistic schools and constructing therefrom a composite philosophic system in harmony with the convictions of the eclectic himself. Eclecticism can scarcely be considered philosophically or logically sound, for as individual schools arrive at their conclusions by different methods of reasoning, so the philosophic product of fragments from these schools must necessarily be built upon the foundation of conflicting premises. Eclecticism, accordingly, has been designated the layman's cult. In the Roman Empire, little thought was devoted to philosophic theory. Consequently, most of its thinkers were of the eclectic type. Cicero is the outstanding example of early eclecticism, for his writings are a veritable potpourri of invaluable fragments from earlier schools of thought. Eclecticism appears to have had its inception at the moment when men first doubted the possibility of discovering ultimate truth. Observing all so-called knowledge to be mere opinion at best, the less studious furthermore concluded that the wiser course to pursue was to accept that which appeared to be the most reasonable of the teachings of any school or individual. From this practice, however, arose a pseudo-broad-mindedness devoid of the element of preciseness found in true logic and philosophy. The Neo-Pythagorean school flourished in Alexandria during the 1st century of the Christian era. Only two names stand out in connection with it: Apollonius of Tyana and Moderatus of Gades. Neo-Pythagoreans is a link between the older pagan philosophies and Neoplatonism. Like the former, it contained many exact elements of thought derived from Pythagoras and Plato. Like the latter, it emphasized metaphysical speculation and ascetic habits. A striking similarity has been observed by several authors between Neo-Pythagoreanism and the doctrines of the Essenes. Special emphasis was laid upon the mystery of numbers, and it is possible that the Neo-Pythagoreans had a far wider knowledge of the true teachings of Pythagoras than is available today. Even in the 1st century, Pythagoras was regarded more as a god than a man, and the revival of his philosophy was resorted to apparently in the hope that his name would stimulate interest in the deeper systems of learning. But Greek philosophy had passed the zenith of its splendor. The mass of humanity was awakening to the importance of physical life and physical phenomena. The emphasis upon earthly affairs, which began to assert itself later, reached maturity of expression in 20th century materialism and commercialism, even though Neoplatonism was to intervene and many centuries passed before this emphasis took definite form. Although Ammonius Saccas was long believed to be the founder of Neoplatonism, the school had its true beginning in Plotinus. Prominent among the Neoplatonists of Alexandria, Syria, Rome, and Athens were Porphyry, Iamblichus, Sallustius, the Emperor Julian, Plutarch, and Proclus. Neoplatonism was the supreme effort of decadent pagandom to publish and thus preserve for posterity its secret doctrine. In its teachings, ancient idealism found its most perfect expression. Neoplatonism was concerned almost exclusively with the problems of higher metaphysics. It recognized the existence of a secret and all-important doctrine which from the time of the earliest civilizations had been concealed within the rituals, symbols, and allegories of religions and philosophies. To the mind unacquainted with its fundamental tenets, Neoplatonism may appear to be a mass of speculations interspersed with extravagant flights of fancy. Such a viewpoint, however, ignores the institutions of the mysteries, those secret schools into whose profundities of idealism nearly all of the first philosophers of antiquity were initiated. When the physical body of pagan thought collapsed, An attempt was made to resurrect the form by instilling new life into it by the unveiling of its mystical truths. This effort apparently was barren of results. Despite the antagonism, however, between pristine Christianity and Neoplatonism, many basic tenets of the latter were accepted by the former and woven into the fabric of patristic philosophy. Briefly described, Neoplatonism is a philosophic code which conceives every physical or concrete body of doctrine to be merely the shell of a spiritual verity which may be discovered through meditation and certain exercises of a mystic nature. In comparison to the esoteric spiritual truths which they contain, the corporeal bodies of religion and philosophy were considered relatively of little value. Likewise, no emphasis was placed upon the material sciences. The term patristic is employed to designate the philosophy of the fathers of the early Christian Church. Patristic philosophy is divided into two general epochs, Ante-Nicene and Post-Nicene. The Ante-Nicene period in the main was devoted to attacks upon paganism and to apologies and defenses of Christianity. The entire structure of pagan philosophy was assailed and the dictates of faith elevated above those of reason. In some instances, efforts were made to reconcile the evident truths of paganism with Christian revelation. Eminent among the Ante-Nicene fathers were Saint Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, and Justin Martyr. In the post-Nicene period, more emphasis was placed upon the unfoldment of Christian philosophy along Platonic and Neoplatonic lines, resulting in the appearance of many strange documents of a lengthy, rambling, and ambiguous nature, nearly all of which were philosophically unsound. The post-Nicene philosophers included Athanasius, Gregory of Nyssa, and Cyril of Alexandria. The patristic school is notable for its emphasis upon the supremacy of man throughout the universe. Man was conceived to be a separate and divine creation, the crowning achievement of deity and an exception to the suzerainty of natural law. To the patristics it was inconceivable that there should ever exist another creature so noble, so fortunate, or so able as man, for whose sole benefit and edification all the kingdoms of nature were primarily created. Patristic philosophy culminated in Augustinianism, which may best be defined as Christian Platonism. Opposing the Pelasgian doctrine that man is the author of his own salvation, Augustinianism elevated the Church and its dogmas to a position of absolute infallibility, a position which it successfully maintained until the Reformation. Gnosticism, a system of emanationism, interpreting Christianity in terms of Greek, Egyptian, and Persian metaphysics, appeared in the latter part of the first century of the Christian era. Practically all the information extant regarding the Gnostics and their doctrines, stigmatized as heresy by the Ante-Nicene Church Fathers, is derived from the accusations made against them, particularly from the writings of Saint Irenaeus. In the 3rd century appeared Manichaeism, a dualistic system of Persian origin, which taught that good and evil were forever contending for universal supremacy. In Manichaeism, Christ is conceived to be the principle of redeeming good in contradistinction to the man Jesus, who was viewed as an evil personality. The death of Boethius in the 6th century marked the close of the ancient Greek school of philosophy. The 9th century saw the rise of the new school of scholasticism, which sought to reconcile philosophy with theology. Representative of the main divisions of the scholastic school were the eclecticism of John of Salisbury, the mysticism of Bernard of Clairvaux and Saint Bonaventura, the rationalism of Peter Abelard, and the pantheistic mysticism of Meister Eckhart. Among the Arabian Aristotelians were Avicenna and Averroes. The zenith of scholasticism was reached with the advent of Albertus Magnus and his illustrious disciple, Saint Thomas Aquinas. Thomism sought to reconcile the various factions of the scholastic school. Thomism was basically Aristotelian with the added concept that faith is a projection of reason. Scotism, or the doctrine of voluntarism promulgated by Jonas Duns Scotus, a Franciscan scholastic, emphasized the power and efficacy of the individual will, as opposed to Thomism. The outstanding characteristic of scholasticism was its frantic effort to cast all European thought in an Aristotelian mold. Eventually the schoolmen descended to the level of mere wordmongers, who picked the words of Aristotle so clean that nothing but the bones remained. It was this decadent school of meaningless verbiage against which Sir Francis Bacon directed his bitter shafts of irony, and which he relegated to the potter's field of discarded notions. The Baconian or inductive system of reasoning cleared the way for the schools of modern science. Bacon was followed by Thomas Hobbes, who held mathematics to be the only exact science and thought to be essentially a mathematical process. Hobbes declared matter to be the only reality, and scientific investigation to be limited to the study of bodies, the phenomena relative to their probable causes, and the consequences which flow from them under every variety of circumstance. Hobbes laid special stress upon the significance of words, declaring understanding to be the faculty of perceiving the relationship between words and the objects for which they stand. Having broken away from the scholastic and theological schools, post-Reformation or modern, philosophy experienced a most prolific growth along many diverse lines. According to humanism, man is the measure of all things. Rationalism makes the reasoning faculties the basis of all knowledge. Political philosophy holds that man must comprehend his natural, social, and national privileges. Empiricism declares that alone to be true which is demonstrable by experiment or experience. Moralism emphasizes the necessity of right conduct as a fundamental philosophic tenet. Idealism asserts the realities of the universe to be superphysical, either mental or psychical. Realism, the reverse, and phenomenalism restricts knowledge to facts or events which can be scientifically described or explained. The most recent developments in the field of philosophic thought are behaviorism and neorealism. The former estimates the intrinsic characteristics through an analysis of behavior. The latter may be summed up as the total extinction of idealism. Baruch de Spinoza, the eminent Dutch philosopher, conceived God to be a substance absolutely self-existent and needing no other conception besides itself to render it complete and intelligible. The nature of this being was held by Spinoza to be comprehensible only through its attributes, which are extension and thought. These combine to form an endless variety of aspects or modes. The mind of man is one of the modes of infinite thought, the body of man one of the modes of infinite extension. Through reason man is enabled to elevate himself above the illusionary world of the senses and find eternal repose in perfect union with the divine essence. Spinoza, it has been said, deprived God of all personality, making deity synonymous with the universe. German philosophy had its inception with Gottfried Wilhelm von Leibniz, whose theories are permeated with the qualities of optimism and idealism. Leibniz's criteria of sufficient reason revealed to him the insufficiency of Descartes' theory of extension, and he therefore concluded that substance itself contained an inherent power in the form of an incalculable number of separate and all-sufficient units. Matter reduced to its ultimate particles ceases to exist as a substantial body, being resolved into a mass of immaterial ideas or metaphysical units of power, to which Leibniz applied the term monad. Thus, the universe is composed of an infinite number of separate monadic entities unfolding spontaneously through the objectification of innate active qualities. All things are conceived as consisting of single monads of varying magnitudes or of aggregations of these bodies, which may exist as physical, emotional, mental, or spiritual substances. God is the first and greatest monad. The spirit of man is an awakened monad in contradistinction to the lower kingdoms whose governing monadic powers are in a semi-dormant state. Though a product of the Leibnizian-Wolffian school, Immanuel Kant, like Locke, dedicated himself to investigation of the powers and limits of human understanding. The result was his critical philosophy, embracing the critique of pure reason, the critique of practical reason, and the critique of judgment. Dr. William James Durant sums up Kant's philosophy in the concise statement that he rescued mind from matter. The mind Kant conceived to be the selector and coordinator of all perceptions, which in turn are the result of sensations grouping themselves about some external object. In the classification of sensations and ideas, the mind employs certain categories of sense, time and space, of understanding, quality, relation, modality, and causation, and the unity of apperception. Being subject to mathematical laws, time and space are considered absolute and sufficient bases for exact thinking. Kant's practical reason declared that while the nature of noumenon could never be comprehended by the reason, the fact of morality proves the existence of three necessary postulates: free will, immortality, and God. In the Critique of Judgment, Kant demonstrates the union of the noumenon and the phenomenon in art and biological evolution. German superintellectualism is the outgrowth of an overemphasis of Kant's theory of the autocratic supremacy of the mind over sensation and thought. The philosophy of Johann Gottlieb Fichte was a projection of Kant's philosophy, wherein he attempted to unite Kant's practical reason with his pure reason. Fichte held that the known is merely the contents of the consciousness of the knower, and that nothing can exist to the knower until it becomes part of those contents. Nothing is actually real, therefore, except the facts of one's own mental experience. Recognizing the necessity of certain objective realities, Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph von Schelling, who succeeded Fichte in the chair of philosophy at Jena, first employed the doctrine of identity as the groundwork for a complete system of philosophy. Whereas Fichte regarded self as the absolute, von Schelling conceived infinite and eternal mind to be the all-pervading cause. Realization of the absolute is made possible by intellectual intuition which, being a superior or spiritual sense, is able to dissociate itself from both subject and object. Kant's categories of space and time von Schelling conceived to be positive and negative respectively, and material existence the result of the reciprocal action of these two expressions. Von Schelling also held that the absolute in its process of self-development proceeds according to a law or rhythm consisting of three movements. The first, a reflective movement, is the attempt of the infinite to embody itself in the finite. The second, that of subsumption, is the attempt of the absolute to return to the infinite after involvement in the finite. The third, that of reason, is the neutral point wherein the two former movements are blended. George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel considered the intellectual intuition of von Schelling to be philosophically unsound and hence turned his attention to the establishment of a system of philosophy based upon pure logic. Of Hegel, it has been said that he began with nothing and showed with logical precision how everything had proceeded from it in logical order. Hegel elevated logic to a position of supreme importance, in fact as a quality of the absolute itself. God he conceived to be a process of unfolding which never attains to the condition of unfoldment. In like manner, thought is without either beginning or end. Hegel further believed that all things owe their existence to their opposites and that all opposites are actually identical. Thus, the only existence is the relationship of opposites to each other, through whose combinations new elements are produced. As the divine mind is an eternal process of thought never accomplished, Hegel assails the very foundation of theism, and his philosophy limits immortality to the ever-flowing deity alone. Evolution is consequently the never-ending flow of divine consciousness out of itself. All creation, though continually moving, never arrives at any state other than that of ceaseless flow. Johann Friedrich Herbart's philosophy was a realistic reaction from the idealism of Fichte and von Schelling. To Herbart, the true basis of philosophy was the great mass of phenomena continually moving through the human mind. Examination of phenomena, however, demonstrates that a great part of it is unreal, at least incapable of supplying the mind with actual truth. To correct the false impressions caused by phenomena and discover reality, Herbart believed it necessary to resolve phenomena into separate elements, for reality exists in the elements and not in the whole. He stated that objects can be classified by three general terms: thing, matter, and mind, the first a unit of several properties, the second an existing object, the third a self-conscious being. All three notions give rise, however, to certain contradictions, with whose solution Herbart is primarily concerned. For example, consider matter. Though capable of filling space, if reduced to its ultimate state, it consists of incomprehensibly minute units of divine energy occupying no physical space whatsoever. The true subject of Arthur Schopenhauer's philosophy is the will. The object of his philosophy is the elevation of the mind to the point where it is capable of controlling the will. Schopenhauer likens the will to a strong blind man who carries on his shoulders the intellect, which is a weak lame man possessing the power of sight. The will is the tireless cause of manifestation, and every part of nature the product of will. The brain is the product of the will to know, the hand the product of the will to grasp. The entire intellectual and emotional constitutions of man are subservient to the will and are largely concerned with the effort to justify the dictates of the will. Thus, the mind creates elaborate systems of thought simply to prove the necessity of the thing willed. Genius, however, represents the state wherein the intellect has gained supremacy over the will and the life is ruled by reason and not by impulse. The strength of Christianity, said Schopenhauer, lay in its pessimism and conquest of individual will. His own religious viewpoints resembled closely the Buddhistic. To him, nirvana represented the subjugation of will. Life, the manifestation of the blind will to live, he viewed as a misfortune, claiming that the true philosopher was one who, recognizing the wisdom of death, resisted the inherent urge to reproduce his kind. Of Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche, it has been said that his peculiar contribution to the cause of human hope was the glad tidings that God had died of pity. The outstanding features of Nietzsche's philosophy are his doctrine of eternal recurrence and the extreme emphasis placed by him upon the will to power, a projection of Schopenhauer's will to live. Nietzsche believed the purpose of existence to be the production of a type of all-powerful individual, designated by him the Superman. This Superman was the product of careful culturing, for if not separated forcibly from the mass and consecrated to the production of power, the individual would sink back to the level of the deadly mediocre. Love, Nietzsche said, should be sacrificed to the production of the Superman, and those only should marry who are best fitted to produce this outstanding type. Nietzsche also believed in the rule of the aristocracy, both blood and breeding being essential to the establishment of this superior type. Nietzsche's doctrine did not liberate the masses. It rather placed over them supermen for whom their inferior brothers and sisters should be perfectly reconciled to die. Ethically and politically, the Superman was a law unto himself. To those who understand the true meaning of power to be virtue, self-control, and truth, the ideality behind Nietzsche's theory is apparent. To the superficial, however, it is. Do you want access to this and all the complete audiobooks on the channel, plus the ebook version? Click the link in the description or scan the QR code in the left corner of the screen to access our library, where you can listen to your favorite esoteric books without ad interruptions, lock your screen, or use other apps while the narration plays, and even download the ebook version to follow along as you listen. Listen on your computer via web browser, or download the app from the Play Store. After subscribing, you will receive an email with your login details, password, and step-by-step instructions on how to access the books through the Hotmart app.